Oh, I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Lung Cancer Living Room. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight's topic, we're kicking off 2021, new year, new era, ushering in a new generation of vaccines. I know that COVID has been on everybody's minds for going on a year now, and the vaccines were introduced at the end of last year. So we're going to talk a little bit about what they are, how they work, and what to sort of expect. And with us tonight, we have Dr. Amy Moore, who is our Director of Science and Research here at GoTo Foundation. I think most of you, if you aren't new to the program, have seen Amy talking on here before. She's sort of our in-house expert when it comes to COVID and lung cancer. And then we, of course, have Dr. Fred Hirsch, who's an MD, PhD, Executive Director, Center for Thoracic Oncology at Mount Sinai Center, Mount Sinai Health System, Professor of Medicine and Pathology. I'm going to mess this up. Icahn, sorry, Fred, School of Medicine, Joe Lowe and Lewis Price, Professor of Medicine, Associate Director at the Tisch Cancer Institute. Dr. Hirsch is no stranger to GoTo Foundation, and we are thrilled to have him here tonight to talk with us. So as I said earlier, tonight we're going to be talking all things vaccine, but I think it's important first to kind of start at the beginning. There was a lot of talk, mid to late 2020 about both Pfizer and Moderna and them being sort of on this fast track towards coming up with something that would work against COVID-19. And I think it's important that we understand what those are and how they work. With that, I think we can jump right in, and we're going to start with Amy. And can you talk a little bit about both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are mRNA based? Can you talk a little bit about what is mRNA?
Right. So that stands for messenger ribonucleic acid. And we talk about the central dogma of molecular biology. That's this idea that DNA, which is effectively the blueprint for what makes you you, that DNA gets converted to mRNA, and then that in turn makes proteins. So that's what we learn as we're coming up through the science of this. But effectively, what that is it's just a molecule, a recipe for making a particular component of the coronavirus particle. So in this case, both Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines are mRNA encoding the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, which leads to COVID-19. So it's just a recipe, a way of tricking our bodies into thinking that we've been exposed to the virus without us actually being infected with the virus. It's that intermediate between DNA and protein. That's the way to think of what messenger RNA is. But in terms of the vaccine, it's effectively a recipe for causing our bodies to mount an immune response against it, to make that spike protein, which is the little things that protrude out from the virus particle when you see the cartoon representation, those little spikes. That's what we're going to get an immune response against, and that's what the mRNA allows us to do.
Do all vaccines work the same?
No. So in this case, both Pfizer and Moderna are the two vaccines that are currently approved in the United States. But there are other vaccines globally using different platforms that have been developed. So another one that people might be familiar with is the Oxford Astrazeneca vaccine, which has been approved in the UK and in other parts. And that is using an adenovirus, which is another type of virus, but I kind of compare it to using that virus as a Trojan horse. So it's not a virus that can replicate or make more copies of itself when it's introduced to your body. So it's not replication competent, but it basically just carries that spike protein message again into your body to trigger an immune response. So AstraZeneca is using this replication incompetent adenovirus vector. Same for Johnson & Johnson's vaccine that's coming, the Janssen vaccine, also using adenovirus, as well as the Russian Sputnik vaccine that you may have heard some talk about. There is another vaccine that was developed by Chinese investigators that is an inactivated form of the COVID virus. So there are different platforms that all have different modalities. There are pluses and minuses to each one. I think in terms of Moderna and Pfizer here in the US, people ask me, should I get one over the other? Is one better than the other? And I always say it's 6 of one, half dozen of another in terms of Moderna compared to Pfizer. They have equivalent efficacy. They're both approaching 95% efficacy in preventing severe COVID-19 disease. In terms of how they're stored, there's subtle differences. One, Pfizer has to be kept at super, super cold temperatures. Moderna, not quite as cold, so it may give it, greater flexibility in administration and in the locations where it can be kept. Not all facilities have the super cold freezers required to keep Pfizer's vaccine at temperature. So that's a differentiator. But in terms of, is one going to work better for you than the other? They're equivalent. That's the way we need to think about them. Some of the comparisons with other vaccines that are on the market, are with Janssen's Johnson & Johnson vaccine that's coming online. It will be a one-shot regime instead of 2 shots. So, there are things like that may come online and make it easier, where we're not talking about having to come back at 21 days or 28 days, for example. So there are multiple shots on goal, which is encouraging. There are different approaches in how they're being developed, and that may give us even better coverage. And Dr. Hirsch may have perspective on this too. I think by having the mRNA vaccines, by having the adenovirus vector vaccines, by having protein subunit vaccines, by having inactivated virus vaccines, we have a comprehensive attack on the virus from multiple angles. And I think that gives us greater flexibility. The issue here is simply supply right now, frankly, in the US and worldwide. So the more that these vaccines come online, that gives us greater opportunity to get more people vaccinated and get us to the point that we can get beyond this pandemic.
The mRNA is educating the body to develop antibodies and specific immune cell reaction to this specific spike protein. And the good thing with this mRNA thing is when it has finished its job to educate the immune system, it degrade and disappear.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So people are asking the whole time, how long time do we have this mRNA in the body? The mRNA doesn't even go into the nucleus of the cell. It stays outside the nucleus, and when it has done its educational job, it actually degrades within a few weeks.
We heard a lot of big sciencey words about mRNA and how these things work and, what sort of drives what where. But at the end of the day, it's really the mechanism by which these drugs work, and they differ, Amy, and you explained that, right? So
yes,
when we're talking about these mRNA, specifically the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, to your point, Dr. Hirsch, we get a lot of those questions about, is it similar to like a polio inoculation where you get your series of shots and then you're done? You're immune for life, right? Or so how does this work? What are we thinking? Is it going to be an annual, vaccination?
Moderna has released some data suggesting that the immunity conferred by their vaccine lasts or has durability of at least a year. I think what everyone expects is that SARS-CoV-2 will become part of our seasonal virus landscape, meaning it will still circulate like the flu and other respiratory viruses. Now, I anticipate that we will have to get regular vaccination against SARS-CoV-2. We don't yet know if that's going to be annually or every 2 to 3 years. But this is not going to be a sterilizing immunity. So it's not going to be something where you get this one shot or series of shots and you're protected for life. Dr. Hirsch, I don't know if you would like to weigh in on that as well.
We don't know, as Amy says. We know that the antibodies which we have built up in the body after vaccination or after infection could last for at least for a year. But we don't have longer follow-up. So we don't know what happened after 1.5 years, after 2 years, after 3 years. So that is a question we need to study. Another thing we need to study is, does everyone react on this in the same way on the infection or on the vaccination? In other words, do we all have the same immune response? Our theory is that patients with lung cancer or other patients with cancer, they might not have the same strong immune response as so-called normal, healthy individuals.
Right.
So that is something we are currently studying together with GoTo Foundation. We are studying whether lung cancer patients eventually have a weakened antibody response compared to so-called healthy individuals. We don't know the answer to that, but that is our hypothesis. And why do we say that? Why do we raise that hypothesis? But there is something we know. We know from studies that lung cancer patients who are hospitalized for COVID had a very aggressive course. That raised some alarms. What is it about lung cancer patients which give them this aggressive course when they get COVID? And that is exactly what we are trying to study these days. Is it because they respond to the infection poorly compared to other group of populations? It could be. That is our hypothesis, but we don't know the answer to it. And we don't know the answer to, does cancer patients in general have a different duration of antibody response compared to so-called healthy individuals?
Yeah.
In terms of your original question, I do think this virus will continue to circulate. We now know there are 7 coronaviruses that, have come into existence. So there's 4 that are kind of naturally circulating, endemic in the population. They don't really cause severe disease. Then there was the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. And then there was the Middle East respiratory syndrome virus, and so those have, SARS basically extinguished itself. MERS is not a major issue. We still hear ongoing pop-ups of infections, but SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, I think, is different. And so I think we are going to continue, even as vaccines roll out and we get more people vaccinated, we're going to be dealing with this for some time. And, there's going to be flare-ups. And that's why it's important that we get everybody vaccinated as quickly as possible. And I know you have some other questions just related to kind of some of the basics of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID before we kind of get into the deeper weeds of how this intersects with lung cancer specifically.
Yeah, I think one question that patients want answered is that if they have actually had the coronavirus, should they also get a vaccine? Or
Absolutely.
do the antibodies keep them safe? That's what they want to know.
Yeah.
Absolutely, they should get vaccinated.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my follow-up questions based on some of the things I'm hearing, because I'm hearing just because you've received the vaccine or just because you've had and recovered from COVID and have antibodies does not mean you are protected for life, right? So that's what I'm hearing you guys say. And I just want to make sure that the audience understands that that's sort of just sort of in the box of what we're talking about right now. And one of the other things before we move on that I don't want patients to get confused around is we keep talking about immune responses. And we talk about that a lot in other areas on the living room, particularly as it pertains to immunotherapy. So I want them to understand that we're talking about immune responses for sure, but in two different ways, and that one is not the same as the other.
Right. So when that mRNA is introduced into your cells and you get the injection locally in your upper arm, it triggers special cells of your immune system called macrophages to, express or to make the spike protein from that recipe that it's just received, and that special cell can, kind of put it on its, outside its cell membrane and kind of show that it's expressing this, and that triggers the T cells and B cells to kind of do their thing and to, produce the antibodies and also, produce cellular immunity against the virus. So, that's how we're harnessing the immune system, these multiple cells that protect us from viruses and other external threats. That's how we're channeling it to fight against this virus.
One of the things I want to talk about to try to alleviate or quell the fears that some folks are having about this new technology because of feelings that they could potentially be unsafe because they were rushed through the process and now they're to market. Can you speak a little bit about this, particularly how these types of mRNA vaccines have been in development for years in other diseases?
It feels like these materialized overnight, right? And we heard about Operation Warp Speed. And so people have this fear of this new technology. It's this scary sounding word, a bunch of letters. They don't know what it means. But, I'm trained as a basic scientist, and I can tell you that these vaccines are built on years of science. And before they were pursued for SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 specifically, mRNA vaccines were already being developed and tested in clinical trials for cancer. There were clinical trials using this technology against melanoma and other tumors. It's been developed and tested against other infectious agents, so Zika and other viruses. So this isn't technology that just materialized and dropped from the sky. There is a history behind it. And, we knew enough because of that we were able to rapidly tap into all that science that had come beforehand that people maybe weren't familiar with, but to harness it and leverage it in a rapid manner in this context. So I think that's first and foremost, that even though it felt rushed, there is science behind it. But then again, Moderna and Pfizer did do or conduct large-scale phase 3 clinical trials on tens of thousands of patients. So, in terms of the vaccine safety, I think Dr. Hirsch would agree that the safety profile is overwhelmingly positive for both of these viruses. 95% effectiveness is as good as we could have hoped for, even better than I think we hoped for. And I think we cannot undersell that message that these vaccines are going to save people's lives. They are going to save people's lives. And there are scary things we hear about, allergy and anaphylaxis and this, that, and the other. It may alter your DNA or it may cause sterility. I've heard that one too. I would say maybe some of that was more prevalent in the fall as these vaccines were, rolling out. Now that they're here, I think confidence is growing. The more people that get vaccinated, I think it's and people are sharing their vaccines, as we're calling it. They're taking pictures as they get vaccinated. I think that's going a long way to reassure the public that they are safe. And that's an important message for us to convey to our community. These vaccines are overwhelmingly safe. The few adverse events that we've witnessed are rare. They are easily managed in the case of the anaphylaxis. And so that should not dissuade anybody from getting vaccinated.
And so when we're talking about some of these myths or these concerns and conversations that our patient population is having, particularly when it comes to altering DNA, I know, Dr. Hirsch, you mentioned it earlier, but does that have specifically to do with the fact that because of where you said this mRNA remains versus entering the nucleus? Is that sort of how this works and how we know that not to be necessarily things people should worry about?
Everyone is asking, does this vaccine interfere with the normal DNA we have in the cells? And at least for the mRNA vaccine, the answer is clearly no. And I think it is clearly no for the DNA-based vaccine approaches too. So I wouldn't be concerned about that. I think Amy is absolutely right. These vaccines are, I think you used the word overwhelmingly safe and effective, way more effective than you actually could hope for, to be honest. In the beginning of this development, they talked about an effective bar, like if 60, 70 would be amazing, but in the 60 would be sufficient for bringing it to the market. And now we saw the results, 95% effectiveness, and the few cases of infection in the treated group was actually very mild cases. So they are really effective. I think it is. I agree with the people who are using the word medical miracle, having those vaccines to the market within such a short time frame. I'm working with world leaders in virology at my institution, and they tell me that this development has been unbelievable quick, without cutting corners in terms of safety, efficacy. The main thing has been cutting financial corners and bureaucracy. So that is one of the reasons they have been able to move this so quickly forward. That is the words from my colleagues who are world leaders in the field, and they see that this is a process which usually could take from 5 to 10 years, something between there. So it is amazing we are where we are, and as quick as possible and as many as possible should certainly take advantage of it.
Danielle, I just want to clarify one thing that Dr. Hirsch said that I don't want people to misinterpret when he said the few cases of infection in people who've been vaccinated. In the case of the mRNA vaccines, you are not receiving infectious virus. The vaccines themselves cannot give people the infection, the virus. Now, the challenge or concern is, of course, in both cases, we're talking about 2 doses. So it is still possible within the window of that first vaccination that somebody could have become infected just prior or immediately after vaccination when you are not yet fully protected. So you, in both cases, Pfizer and Moderna, you must receive both doses to achieve full protection. So I just want to make sure for our audience who I know hang on, the words of leaders as eminent as Dr. Hirsch, that this vaccine is not going to give you the virus. That is not a concern with mRNA.
But we agree that effectiveness is 95%. It is not 100%.
Right.
So there are a few people in the study who got the infection not because of the vaccination, but where where the vaccination didn't give sufficient protection.
Right.
But
yep.
Even in those few cases, they were all mild cases.
Yes.
So that means that some kind of protection has been given also probably to the last 5%.
Should they get the antibody test prior to getting a vaccine, or should they get the vaccine and then get an antibody test, or does it matter?
My opinion, and Dr. Hirsch can offer his as well, is you should not wait to get vaccinated because, the protection conferred by natural infection, as he just said earlier, it may last many months, it may last a year. We don't know how long it's going to last. And there have been rare cases of reinfection. So I think, we want everybody to get vaccinated when it's their turn. I think that's a key piece of this as well, given the challenges around current availability. We want to get our most vulnerable patients vaccinated first, but I would encourage everyone to get it. And I don't think we've built it into the system to do what you're saying, to test people's antibody levels or antibody titers before they get vaccinated. Our system, I don't think could handle that, honestly, and there's variability. So I think it's just get vaccinated when your age group, your category comes up. We encourage you to get vaccinated.
Given the speed with which we were able to get this done, right? In under a year, we were able to come up with 2 drugs, 2 vaccines for COVID-19. How do we apply the lessons that we learned there to speed up breakthroughs for lung cancer, or getting drugs to patients quicker for lung cancer?
The challenge, or the reason we were able to move so rapidly in the case of this virus, is viruses are very simple organisms. They're not live in that they must infect a host, and that's how they replicate themselves, make more copies. So they're really just packages of proteins and some form of nucleic acid, DNA or RNA. Very simple. And that's an easier nut to crack in some regards than cancer, which is a very complex, multifactorial disease, an accumulation of multiple mutations impacting very varying cellular pathways. So I hear what the patients say, and I share their frustration that, it feels like all this money and manpower has been harnessed and directed toward this goal of, developing a vaccine for COVID-19. It may be an oversimplification. There may be pieces of the lung cancer fight that we can accelerate, but it's not an apples to apples comparison. And I say that with great, frustration myself and appreciation for our community.
I do believe that the mRNA approach will be much more in focus also for cancer in the future.
Absolutely.
I do believe that the pandemic has learned us and FDA and NCI and other vital organizations that there are things in our development process for new drugs which can be changed or modified. And I think we had to modify some processes in this pandemic period. And I think some of those modifications, it can be approval processes for FDA, it can be financial processes from NCI and others, it can be telemedicine, it can be other things. I think we have learned something here which can be useful in the future for our cancer patients. But having said that, Daniel, I do believe we are in many ways privileged in the lung cancer field and in the cancer field to have seen, in my opinion, a dramatic progress over the last few years. We have seen a tremendous progress we should be proud of, and we should continue to see this progress. And your organization is dealing with ALK survivors. You're dealing with EGFR survivors. You're dealing with N-trackers. They will verify that we have come long way within relative short time, and we will continue to do this. But to the question, yes, I think the pandemic, and I think what we learned from this development with COVID will transform a lot of aspects in our own cancer drug development.
I think it's a miracle that we are where we are today with the vaccines that we have at hand and more to come and everything. I think if we've done anything that hasn't been excellent, it's the processes and getting the distribution systems involved and all of that preparatory work to actually get these vaccines delivered while we continue to improve the science and make it better and better and better. So, I think it's multi-tiered, and let the science people do the science, and then bring in the right people to do the processes and the distributions.
One of the things I want to go back to the why do things take so long in lung cancer and in cancer treatment? And I think one of the things we have to recognize and sort of point out is funding. The funding, for lung cancer, particularly federal funding, we need money. We need more money, right? We just got back up to our 20 million at the end of 2020, which is a huge success, but it's not enough, right? So we need more. Right. And also, I think we have to look to the percentage of patients who participate in clinical trials. As you stated, Dr. Hirsch, these trials were filled fairly quickly with tens of thousands of patients, right? So it was easier to kind of get to the end of the line faster. And so I think those are two things that are also factor in, and our community needs to know. We are constantly encouraging patients to talk to their physicians about clinical trials as an option at some time during their treatment.
But on that point, only about 4% of the clinical trial participants for these trials were cancer patients. And that feeds into, I think, some of the ongoing struggles and challenges around, our current collaboration, which is calling for prioritization of patients with cancer for vaccination against COVID-19. There were, I think, rightfully so, concerns about this new technology and how it may impact patients with cancer and other comorbidities. But I think universally now we're seeing these calls by all the leading oncology societies that, patients with cancer should be vaccinated. It's safe for them to be vaccinated. So yes, we need more money. We need more people participating in clinical trials. But that was one of the things that probably is negatively impacting our community in terms of these vaccines, is that there was so little representation of patients with cancer in these clinical trials.
We need more patients in clinical trials. We need more money. But might be we also need to do clinical trials more smoothly. Efficiently. That is the right word.
Exactly.
Again, I do believe the pandemic has learned us something in all those aspects, and I do believe that the approval process and the clinical trial process and even the financial process will change after this. And the way we are working together in the early beginning of this pandemic, we realized the importance of working together. We said we need to come together. And that's right. Did. We brought people in, we invited people in, academia, patients, advocates, organization, FDA, NCI, and meet. Yep. We meet every second week, and we discuss how can we work together to reach the goals together as soon as possible.
And I really, really want to get information out to our community about some of the work you're doing. You out there in New York are a recognized authority on lung cancer, and together with Dr. Pulmón, who I believe is still out in Colorado, and Dr. John Minna out there in Texas, have co-founded the COVID Lung Cancer Consortium. I believe it was in early 2020. Can you talk a little bit about the purpose of the CLCC?
Yeah, and that is exactly what we talked about. We realized there needs to be a forum where we can come together as quickly as possible to discuss what are the emerging challenges and how do we together overcome those challenges. We invited FDA, we invited NCI, we invited patient advocacy organizations. We need to sit around the table together and see how do we figure this out as quick as possible. And that was very simply the whole idea with the COVID Lung Cancer Consortium. And results has come out. We have agreed to do studies together. We have applied for funding together, and we have got it. Last week, we discussed how can ASCO and other organizations come together to look into clinical management and clinical trial perspectives. How can we do it better? And several organizations jumped up on the table and said, we want to be a part of it. We want to be a part of it. And that is exactly what we need.
Can you talk a little bit, Dr. Hirsch, both you and Amy, about the grant that GoTo is participating in, how Amy's supporting that effort, what the project is? I know we kind of touched on it, but a little bit more detail about what it means to examine those antibody responses to the SARS-CoV-2 infection, particularly as it pertains to patients with lung cancer.
We came together and applied for this amazing opportunity. And the background is, or the hypothesis was very simple. We saw the data that unfortunately at an early period of this pandemic, the fatality rate for lung cancer patients hospitalized for COVID, more than 30% of them died of COVID. And that is unacceptable in numbers we had to deal with at that time. So I think the situation today is different because we do have treatment options and other possibilities. But that was the data generated in the beginning of the pandemic. But that raised the hypothesis that lung cancer patients has a different and weaker immune response to the infection than other people. So we invited the virology experts to this communication, and they came up immediately and said, let us find together, let us apply, and let us study the antibody response in 1,000 lung cancer patients and compare it with 1,000 so-called healthy individuals. And that is basically what we did together with GoTo Foundation and together with other academic partners. And that is what we are doing these days. And of course, that can tell us something about antibody response and duration in lung cancer patients. But still, we have open questions. How does treatment affect response to infection or response to vaccination? And how do specific treatment affect? How does chemotherapy affect response? How does immunotherapy response is affected by how is the difference in response? So there are a lot of open questions we need to pursue, and we are in discussion with NCI these days how to make those approaches, how to design those studies. It seems to be in a fortunate situation that today there seems to be financial support available. But we need to figure out how do we do those studies so effective and so smoothly and so correct as possible. And that is a process we are in currently.
I think the question, Danielle, is what does that mean for our community? So one, why do lung cancer patients suffer such worse disease and outcomes and heightened mortality? That's a key question. Two, the implications of our study would suggest possibly, that patients with lung cancer may need additional vaccinations. So more, maybe not just 2 shots. Maybe there would be data to support additional shots for this community, or different approaches for managing, vaccination. And that's a key feature of our grant compared to, it's part of a larger initiative that NCI has called the Serological Sciences Network, or SERANET. And it's the largest coordinated effort nationally to understand the immune response to this virus. And so a key feature of ours, compared to the other 25 awards that are part of this, is by design, we built in a vaccinated and an unvaccinated cohort. So there will be learnings that we get from this as the vaccines roll out. In both arms, lung cancer patients and healthy controls will have people who are COVID positive, COVID negative, who've been vaccinated, who have not been vaccinated. And all that will lead us to new understandings and new findings that may suggest alternative approaches for how we approach this disease. How does the immune response work in this population, this vulnerable population? Because as Dr. Hirsch pointed to, this is a convergence that our community cannot afford. It's a respiratory virus. Our patients are already, at risk because, they have lung cancer. So it's a huge opportunity. It's, a great collaboration. And GO2 is supporting this by helping recruit patients across special populations of interest, underserved communities across our, now roughly 800 centers of excellence nationwide. So we have the depth and breadth of reach to allow us to tap into different communities where there's a high COVID prevalence, where there's a high lung cancer burden, where there's geographic diversity and other components. So we're normalizing these arms both for age and sex and gender and smoking status and all those things, but it will give us important information that can hopefully benefit our community.
And with that, I'm going to say goodnight, and we'll see you guys next month. So thanks, everybody.
Oh, I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.